Hi everyone and welcome to my Incinerate Sorcerer's build guide for Season 4. This is a build I've played quite a lot lately. I had a really good time with this, surprisingly to be honest, because it's a standstill and channel kind of build, which is usually not really my cup of tea. But for some reason I really enjoyed this and I want to share it with you. I have a planner where I have multiple setups for leveling and speed farming and then the endgame pit stuff. I gotta say, this is not like the craziest build out there. There are definitely better builds even on the Sorc, and Sorc is already not like a super powerful class right now. But as you can see here, I was still able to take this all the way to the pit in like the Neve Iron territory. So I was farming like 65s, 70s or so in like 3-4 minutes. And this can definitely be further optimized. This is on hardcore, so I had to build this quite tanky because you stand still and channel all the time. You can definitely go a bit more greedy on softcore, try to squeeze out more damage. And also my gear was like usually 0 to 1 greater affixes and masterwork to 4, maybe to 8. And that was about it. So there's definitely like more potential there. And otherwise, it was just like a really great leveling and farming build. I had no trouble whatsoever just starting out, leveling this from 1 to 100 all the way. And for that purpose, it was actually a formidable setup. So I will show you what it's all about. And if you like Incinerate, well, maybe you will like this build as well. So let's get into the planner here. We have multiple setups. Here's leveling. This is also slash speed farming, I guess, where we just try to get to 100 or farm hell tides or something like that. And then we have the endgame and pit version. And finally, we have one with the Harlequin crest. So we just basically swap out one item there. There's a little bit of a progression here, but ultimately it can kind of just play this setup right from the start. So you just like get Incinerate as soon as possible, rank it up, and then there's a few aspects that go with that. You can get some of them from the season journey if you're just starting out with your first character, but if not, I guess you just have to find them or craft them from the caches that you can get at the Alchemist at level 20. So like this, you can get a few of those important modifiers. But I was actually just starting a Sorc without any of the season journey bonuses, and then I just kept playing until I find that stuff, and it was totally fine, even without the right aspects at the start. So the damage is actually relatively high while leveling up, and then slowly later on it falls off a little bit in the pit. It just doesn't really have like this huge damage output, especially against bosses, that you would need to go like really high in the pit. But as you saw in the clip, like farming in the 60s or 70s tier range in the pit is definitely quite doable, which is all right to get your Neve Iron. I'll start with the endgame and pit version here to show you like what the build is about once you have actually kind of finished it. So we spec into Incinerate as soon as possible. We get less damage taken from burning enemies, and you also like just burn enemies around you all the time. And as you saw in the clip, we have this triple beam, which comes from the flamethrower aspect. So this one that I put here on the staff. You want to use a two-handed weapon for this because this aspect is extremely powerful. You see this here. You have 3 beams with 170% of the base power, and they can overlap. So when you stand right on top of an enemy, you hit with all 3 beams, and then you get 510% damage compared to the normal 100%. So that is a massive bonus here, and you want to have this on a two-handed weapon. There are some people that also suggested me to use the Flame Scar wand, which is unique that you can find from Duriel and Dariel. I tried it out. It definitely seemed like a downgrade to me. And even under the circumstances where you have like an incredible Flame Scar with extra greater affix, Incinerate ranks, and all that stuff, it doesn't really seem like it would really overcome the damage loss basically that we have from not having a flamethrower on a two-handed. So I really recommend flamethrowers aspect. And also there's another thing here which is kind of weird that you know, you might be surprised by, which is that we put the elemental surge temper mod here on the weapon. So this is a weapon mod that gives you extra shadow damage. You can also go for extra poison damage. And the reason for that is that we combine this with the Tarasha's ring. So you can get a 4th elemental stack from using either poison or shadow here on the weapon slot. There is a tempo that goes with Incinerate, which is Incinerate size, but apparently this only buffs the size of the middle beam, the main beam basically, and mostly how far it goes. But since you usually want to kind of shotgun enemies with your flamethrower aspect, this really doesn't help you at all. You don't really get like more overlaps between your beams, and it doesn't buff the side beams that come from the aspect. So Incinerate size is kind of worthless, and instead we just get this extra Tarasha stack, and at least it gives us some extra damage. Also, another frequently asked question, I guess, is why do we have percent damage tempers instead of fire damage over time tempers? So if you look at this here, this is this temper. It gives you flat damage to everything basically, and then there is fire damage over time, which is a much higher number. Well, the reason for that is that percent damage applies 2 times for every dot in the game, including Incinerate, which is a dot effect basically. So you always have to take this number times 2. So this actually goes up to almost 400%, and it's just more than the fire damage over time could give you. So that's why we temper this. Some other important aspects that go with the setup here are conflagration. So this goes on the neck. This is also a very powerful damage buff here, up to 60% extra damage. And then sometimes they also explode and burn enemies around them when you hit them with the Incinerate. So that's kind of nice. And we have shredding blades and conceded here. There are a few other like smaller aspects that you could consider. For example, Edge Master's aspect, especially early on when you may not really have like high vulnerable uptime. Then you might want to use, for example, Edge Masters. It's just consistent 20% extra damage, versus here 30% extra only when the enemy is vulnerable. So there is a bit of like an efficiency calculation here, depending on how often you actually have vulnerable uptime, basically, which you mainly get from the Frost Nova and from the Ice Blades in this setup. So it's not 100% consistent to have vulnerable uptime, and there are other options as well. And here's conceded. This is just like a 25% damage buff, and you generally have a barrier. You kind of want to cycle your cooldowns together with the protection passive here that gives you a 3-second barrier. We can increase the duration a little bit, so it's like 3.5 seconds or so. So every 3.5 seconds, you basically want to press one of your buttons to get the conceded buff and just be protected from the barriers. So you kind of need that defense anyway, and this has natural synergy. Then in typical sorcerer fashion, we have all 4 defensive skills. So Flame Shot is just great for survival. Teleport, of course. Ice Armor is also amazing. Gives you a really long barrier, and you can stack it up and like refill it all the time by dealing damage. And we can also chill enemies around us and even deal extra damage against Frozen. So you can, for example, combine Frost Nova and Ice Armor to do like a bit of a burst. Or for example, when the boss is staggered, you can press Ice Armor despite being safe, just to deal that extra damage, for example. And again, activate your conceded buff, for example. So this is really nice. And then lastly, we have the Ice Blades here. The Ice Blades is somewhat optional, but I really like the more consistent vulnerable uptime, because there's not really great ways to trigger vulnerable on a Fire Sorc. So I used Ice Blades, and it also helps us, for example, with the Tal Rasha buff. So you need to deal damage with cold somehow in order to get the last Tal Rasha stack. So there are some ways to do that, but Ice Blades, I have it on the bar and as an enchantment, just to get more of those blades out and just have better vulnerable uptime. And then to get after Shredding Blades, they have a very high chance to make enemies vulnerable, and you get this extra vulnerable damage buff. You slowly reset your cooldowns a little bit, which is helpful as well. You get more flame shields and more ice armors and so on. So it just kind of feels like a nice addition here. Another choice you could go for is Inferno. So you could also just run Inferno on your bar and then maybe keep the Ice Blades enchantment, for example, to get those Ice Blades out sometimes. And this is also not bad, because you can pull enemies together. And as I mentioned, you want to like basically stand right on top of the enemies and burn them right in their face. At least like the tankier enemies, like the elites, for example. So pulling them all together in one spot and then following up with a Frost Nova is really cool. I've done that for a little while as well, but ultimately I just went with the Ice Blades and it was fine. Then we also have the Flame Wall here, or the Firewall. We have the 25% extra burning damage while enemies are standing in it, and we put this in the enchantment slot. We don't actually use that skill on the bar, we just try to trigger this sometimes. We don't have great lucky hit on the setup, but there's not really that many good choices to put in the enchantment slots, and occasionally you can get this 25% burning damage increase, which is actually kind of helpful. Then we have a few passives here that just buff our damage. So we have Glass Cannon, we have the Hoarfrost here. We have these fire passives. Endless Pyre in particular is a pretty good one. So especially in the higher end, when you fight bosses and elites for a longer time, they take more and more damage the longer they burn. This is pretty powerful passive here. There's also Soulfire for extra damage and less mana cost, and a bit of extra mana regen and a bit of extra life recovery. I just put like 1 point in Warmth to like slowly regenerate if something ever goes through your barrier. So that felt kind of nice to have like just 1 point there. And also here is Inner Flames. So this is also another decent passive to get. For example, for your Amulet slot, if you don't get Endless Pyre. So you see here I have Endless Pyre on the neck. But you could also have, for example, Inner Flames or even Glass Cannon. So yes, a few different options. And up here is also Elemental Dominance. Another pretty decent passive to get, for example, on your neck. And here's the key passive. We have Veer's Mastery. So you might be wondering, why is that? Well, we get close damage reduction, which is pretty helpful. So you just want to be tanky in general, and you're generally standing at close range because of the shotgunning effect. And apparently right now this is also bugged. and gives damage bonus to all elements and not just shock skills. So this is kind of helpful, but I actually did put the Virus Mastery into the build mostly because of the close damage reduction, and I wasn't even aware that the damage buff applies to everything. So it's kind of like a nice bonus, I guess. And we can also combine this with the Mage Lord's aspect here, where you get even more close damage reduction when there's enemies nearby, and this makes you generally quite tanky, especially when you're standing in the middle of a pack. So everything is going to be close to you, basically, going to have a lot of damage reduction. But on the other hand, you have to be a bit careful, for example, from ranged attacks. So when there's like a crossbow sniping you or so, as I mentioned, I made the setup fairly tanky. You're not going to just get one shot from off screen, but you do have to be aware that ranged enemies deal a lot more damage to you. Now let's talk about the leveling and farming version. It looks a little bit different. You can see this here. We have especially two different enchantments. We have Fireball enchantment. Just you rank up Fireball to 5. You can even maybe find a glove that has Fireball ranks or core skill ranks. So you buff both the Incinerate and the Fireball. Personally, I was actually leveling with Fireball ranks on my gloves because I never found Incinerate gloves until very late. And that was actually kind of helpful. Just you shoot into a pack or you incinerate into a pack, and then small enemies will just like chain react and the entire pack will blow up and maybe the elite is left or something like that. So for leveling, this is a really great power here to put into your first enchantment slot. And then the second one, I had Teleport. Just go faster, especially when you combine this with attacks reduce evade cooldown. We actually have the wrong mod here right now, but this one, you can also go evade charges really, because Incinerate doesn't reset it that fast, since it only resets when you start a channel. But all the other skills, for example, also reset it. Either way is fine, but Teleport enchantment is just kind of nice to be more mobile, jump into packs, and just go faster basically. We don't really need like this Fireball stuff here when you're just like leveling and farming. Usually that's like one tap of your Incinerate will destroy entire packs, and even bosses I was melting in a few seconds in Nightmare Dungeons, many levels above myself. So we don't really need like this extra damage here. This is mostly for like the pit when stuff gets really tanky. Other than that, most of the setup is fairly similar. So we have the same passives here, we have the same defensive skills, we have this stuff. And I did change the key passive here. So early on, I was actually not running Virus Mastery and I was just running Combustion. So we have the extra burning damage. It's just, for example, in leveling, you don't really necessarily run into the middle of a pack every time and position yourself to shotgun enemies. You just like beam all around you. You can just like, turn your character in all directions and everything around you will just kind of like die. And you're not necessarily at close range all the time to get, for example, this Virus bonus. So in that case, I just went with Combustion. You get a decent burning damage upgrade. And then later on, once you go to like higher end content, you're going to swap to Virus Mastery. And also I changed the aspects a little bit here. So for example, early on, you might not have the Tarasha ring. So here I have the Edge Master's ring, for example. As I mentioned earlier, this is like another decent aspect to just put here as an extra damage power. I also have the Engulfing Flames. This is also an okay power to put here instead of the Shredding Blades. So especially early on when you don't really have Ice Blades very much, you don't really make enemies vulnerable very much, this is an okay power to use as well. And then you have the same flamethrowers and the conflagration here and the Concealer ring. So we have these kind of things there. And for your defensive powers, they're also fairly similar for the progression. So we have for the endgame variant, there's Everliving, Mage Lords, and Concentration. Concentration is nice because you can get this damage reduction on your character from just casting Ice Blades here. So I like that a lot. And it's like very consistent. It may not be always up, but most of the time it is up. And early on, you can also go with something like the protecting aspect, or even like the Juggernaut or so. If you really need armor, for example, while leveling, this is not a bad idea until you get nice armor pieces. You can roll it, for example, here on the pants and then one temper, and you're gonna cap your armor. You want to have that armor cap by the time you reach like World Tier 4 or so. You want to have like 7, 8, up to 9k armor later. So you either do this through multiple rolls on your gear or just throw in a Juggernaut aspect until later. And our last aspect here is Concussive Strikes. So this is just like extra damage, especially against staggered bosses, for example, or you just proc this daze effect sometimes. It's not very consistent, to be honest. So this is kind of like you can do whatever you want. I would say you can also do, for example, like a bound-in conduit aspect for more teleports, or like a movement aspect to go faster. So there are a few options here, especially for farming and leveling. But later on, just go for the damage, I guess. One thing to note here about the items is also you want to have 1 mana per second roll. This just seemed to make it like more smooth and consistent, because Incinerate doesn't actually spend a lot of mana. So it's like, yeah, very low mana cost per second, but having like 1 extra roll was definitely helpful to make sure that I can just perma Incinerate and never have to run out of mana. So I just put like one here on the boots, for example. It doesn't even need to be like crazy masterworked or something like that, but this kind of solved all of the issues by itself. And then the other stats, yeah, we go for typical movement speed, maybe a bit of cooldown, the percent damage as I mentioned. Defensively, there is also a lot of life you can put. There's a bit of dodge chance I have here. There's the flame shield duration that you can also temper, which is pretty powerful. There's frost nova cooldown. I would say kind of like anything goes. You can try to invest more into your flame shield if you want to rely on that. You can invest more into your frost nova if you want to rely on that. Personally, I just went for like a bit of a mix of everything, just to like have like a general well-rounded character basically. But this is ultimately up to you, I would say, what you put on your defensive stuff here. Just want to try to reach a decent amount of life. For example, here with my Paragons in this setup, I have almost 40k life without potions. So that was relatively comfy. And yeah, as I mentioned, you want to be somewhat tanky in order to just stand still and channel sometimes. And you have to be able to tank some hits. Now, finally, let's talk about the Paragons a little bit. So this is our board here. We have 7 Paragon boards in total, also with 7 glyphs. And there is 2 good legendary nodes that we care about. So number 1 is the Burning Instinct here. This gives you extra burning damage bonus based on your intelligence and your critical strike damage. So you want to try to stack a bunch of crit and a bunch of intelligence, but not really too much, because at some point the bonus just kind of dilutes and you just kind of go with the intelligence that you get for the most part, and maybe you have like, you know, one big crit damage roll here on the weapon, but I found that just stacking too much crit damage was not really helpful compared to other stats. So here, like a weapon like this with a bunch of crit damage is kind of nice, just to boost this a little bit further, but the rest just comes from the intelligence. But you see here, this is a 95% bonus, it's pretty powerful, so you can kind of like double your damage or so with just like the int that you're getting on your gear mostly, and like maybe a roll there for crit damage. So that's kind of nice. And then we have the Frigid Fate, so this gives us bonus damage to vulnerable enemies. So this is another reason, for example, to have the Ice Blades and, for example, shorter Frost Nova cooldown, because that makes enemies vulnerable. And we just stack non-physical damage on our Paragon boards. For example, through the Enchanter glyph here, we can get a bunch of non-physical damage, and from like various nodes all over the tree. And you can get to close to the 30% cap here. We have 25% in this planner. And this is another pretty nice damage bonus. And the rest is basically just picking up glyphs and life nodes and maybe some good damage nodes. So we have the control glyph here. We have Tactician, that gives us extra damage when we use a defensive skill. We have Torch, which is extra burning damage. Then we have the Enchanted glyph for the non-physical, gives also a bunch of extra res. We have Reinforce, this is extra damage reduction with a barrier, so that's another reason to have barriers up all the time and cycle your cooldowns a little bit. And then we have Exploit here for the vulnerable damage stacking, and we have Territorial. There is one glyph here that you could also change if you don't really have good vulnerable uptime, which is the Exploit glyph. So this could be replaced with an Elementalist glyph, and then you can like maybe swap a glyph around. So we can, for example, move the Control glyph from the starter board over here to this one, because they're both dexterity glyphs. You can just swap them, and then you can put Elementalist here, which is actually a fairly decent option on the starting board. But this would also mean that you have to hit basically all enemies with fire, cold, or lightning in order to actually really gain a bonus out of this. But it could be another solution here to buff your damage, or just not rely on the vulnerable damage that much if you're not going for that. Personally, when I leveled up this character, I just followed this board right as it was, put all the glyphs as they were, and then I just leveled up the glyphs, and as soon as they were level 15 they came online, and then I tried to finish them up later with boosting to level 21, and it was totally fine and smooth. As I mentioned, the damage in this setup is really good while leveling up anyway, so I don't really have any issues here, especially once you get the flamethrower aspect and maybe the conflagration. Those are the 2 big things really that you kind of want to have here early on, and then everything else just kind of like falls into place as you go, and it's gonna be a pretty smooth ride. And the last point here is the Uber version. So if you get a Harlequin crest, you can equip that. This is a pretty nice item for this build, and we remove the ever-living aspect here. Ever-living only gives us damage reduction from crowd-controlled or vulnerable enemies, which is decent uptime, but it's also reliant on you actually doing something to the enemies, and it doesn't work, for example, for the shadow bosses in the pit. But the Harlequin crest actually does give you 20% damage reduction at all times, and it has amazing stats and gives you the +4 ranks. So this is a bit of a damage boost, helps you with the resources, helps with the cooldowns. So it's just like an all-round really great item to put into this setup here. So if you have that, it helps out quite a bit. And that also concludes the guide. So I'll have this linked in the description. You can go check it out. If you have any feedback, let me know. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this. Wish you good luck with your sorceress, and I'll see you guys next time.